So while we get some chairs up, I'll just frame this next panel up a little bit because, as we've heard, you know, platforms differ pretty substantially from traditional economies by functioning as interconnected systems, enabling multiple participants, users, providers, developers to co-create value. And unlike linear supply chains where value flows in one direction, producer to consumer, we leverage network effects, we manage transaction costs, we deal with coordination costs. And so that the overall value of the system increases as participants join. So with the rise of AI, this is evolving rapidly. We've got enhanced personalization, automated interactions, real-time insights from enormous data sources, making platforms, hopefully more intelligent, certainly more user-centric. New business models and dynamic pricing, autonomous services, further extending value streams. So what I'm hoping to get with this panel is to explore really one of the critical issues that we're facing. So I don't know if anybody's walked outside today. And Boston has always had hot summers, but I don't remember them being this hot, this frequently, in this many parts of the world. So arguably, whether it's popular to talk about or not, it's certainly important to talk about. And so we're looking at this issue of how do we accelerate this transition to a low and no carbon energy economy. And so what we're going to examine is the roles and the ways that platforms and markets can sort of manage and accelerate that transition. And so I have a lot of questions for our panelists because we're super fortunate to have a really crack group here. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just sort of mention, so we have Stina Brock, who is the CEO of Derapi. We've got Randy Spock, the global lead for Google's carbon credits and removals system. Let's see, we have Miranda Ballentine, current CEO of the Foundation for Energy Security and Innovation, and Vanessa Chan, currently, and I'll have an emphasis on that, of Vice Dean of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Penn Engineering. But what I would invite is, starting from Stina, just to give a little bit of background, without stealing the thunder of the questions that we discussed. Just talk a little bit about sort of who you are, your organization, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here today with this fantastic panel. So I'm CEO of Derapi, and we are a startup that is looking to be the connective tissue to bring together distributed energy resources like solar, batteries, EVs, EV chargers, basically electricity consuming devices on the distribution grid, and helping them connect to platforms that are trying to do smart things with these devices, whether that's for consumers to help them save money or to bring them resilience, or to connect them to energy markets or utilities to do smart things for the utility grid and the electricity grid. So I spend a lot of my time talking to folks that are building software platforms and products that are trying to coordinate how these devices operate to provide value for consumers and then also for the grid. And I think what we're seeing is that as the energy transition is happening, there's an explosion of these devices out there. Today, there's 50 million distributed energy resources at US residential customer homes alone, and we're seeing the same thing across the world. So a lot of opportunity to connect devices.
Great.
Very good.
Randy.
Hey, everybody. Randy Spock. I'm our carbon credits and removals lead for Google. And what that means is for Google's remaining emissions, we try to compensate for them by funding projects around the world that have impact on fixing the atmosphere. And basically, we're trying to compensate for whatever emissions we have left over after we decarbonize in whatever way most helps the planet solve climate change. carbon credits and removals is in many ways the complement to the clean energy transition. It's what you need to do on top of the clean energy transition and other forms of decarbonization to actually fix the atmosphere and fix climate change, as Jeff was noting. And just as Google has been a leader in the clean energy side, you may have seen our fusion offtake deal most recently, we're aiming to be a leader in this emergent category as well.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here, and thanks, Jeff, for inviting me. I'm Miranda Ballentine. I'm actually not the CEO of the Foundation for Energy Security and Innovation. We just hired our inaugural CEO. I am the chair of the board of FESI, so very glad to not have that role. But actually probably more relevant for this conversation is I've spent the last 25 years working for a number of very large energy users. Haven't worked for Google, but partnered very closely with Google, including Walmart, which was at the time that I was there the largest user of electricity in the United States that wasn't a government entity, and then went from Walmart to the United States Air Force, which is the largest electricity user in the US government. And actually those two organizations use about the same amount of electricity. I think a couple of things are really relevant for today's conversation. Thinking about the impact to our power systems, which at one time were B2C, big power sends electrons to all of us and we just consumed them. There are a number of impacts of platforms to these systems. So hopefully we can talk about that a little bit today. As we see data centers and AI, and particularly generative AI rising, we're seeing a massive load, new demand coming onto the system for the first time in 15 years. So that's one impact we'll talk about more, I think, in our discussion. But very interesting to the last chart that you just showed of how platforms can grow. We're starting to see more and more platforms in the existing, not even startup space, saying, okay, maybe I was a computer manufacturer, maybe I was a search engine company, but how do I grow into the field of being a platform provider and consumer of electrons? And how can I, as Google or General Motors or Walmart, now begin to get into the virtual power plant space? So that's another thing we could dig into more. There's a number of other things, but I really come from the large energy customer space.
So I'm Vanessa Chan, the Vice Dean of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Penn Engineering, and went there January 20th, 11:59 a.m. Before that, for 4 years, I was the Chief Commercialization Officer at the U.S. Department of Energy, appointed by President Biden. And my remit when I was there was to figure out how do we take the $500 billion that we had gotten from Bill and IRA to catalyze the $23 trillion in the private sector. And DOE, before we had that infusion of money, was really an R&D shop where they're focused on research and development. The total budget for DOE is $40 billion. So when we got $500 billion, it was 10x the budget. And now we had equities in demonstration deployment, the last two stages of commercialization. And so I quarterbacked an effort with the private sector called the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff, where we created the national roadmaps for how to commercialize over a dozen technologies, from distributed energy resources to nuclear to hydrogen. And we tied all the Bill and IRA money to these Pathways to Commercial Liftoff so that the entire nation was singing from one hymn book so we could work together. And then in parallel, also created a new framework for commercialization called adoption readiness levels, because too often we use technology readiness levels as a proxy for a technology being able to be deployed. But TRLs were created in the 70s by NASA to launch rockets to the moon and don't take into account unit economics, supply chain issues, regulatory issues, and so forth. And so we really need to change the way in which we think about commercialization. And during that time also had the pleasure of launching FESI, the foundation, and was very thrilled when Miranda said yes to join the board and become the board chair. And that was also another way to put public-private partnerships on steroids, because the foundation is a way to really catalyze and support what DOE is doing. So very excited to be here and continuing the work right now at Penn Engineering, where I've spent the last 25 years thinking about how to bring technologies to market. And now I'm going to disrupt how engineering students are trained so that we are actually graduating people who understand the real world and are not just publishing papers.
Here.
I'd say here, but as an academic, I do live and die by publishing as well.
Sorry, Jeff. Sorry, Jeff.
We have to change that.
Sorry,
So here.
We have to change that.
Oh, goodness. So I'm going to start with Miranda. And you alluded to or talked about the work that you did at Walmart, and then at the Department of Energy, the Clean Energy Buyers Association, and the Foundation for Energy Security and Innovation. So you've had a sort of an arc that I think that gives you a really unique perspective. And what I'd like to hear about is a bit of that history. So if you go back to when Walmart made some of these original commitments, and you'll get the date better than me, maybe 20 years ago roughly. What I'd like you to share with the group here today is what were some of the key partnerships that you had to create? And then, as Peter mentioned, a lot of these things might have been bilateral. What market mechanisms were in place that you could take advantage of, and what wasn't there that you either wish or you had to build to support those efforts? And then I'll invite the panel to kind of popcorn around this question.
Yeah, great. So indeed, Walmart did set the first corporate goal to be supplied by 100% renewable energy. That was set in 2005. Walmart also set the world's first goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from its vast networked platformed supply chain. And that was in 2008. So, if you fast forward to today and the work that Randy and I do, it's remarkable how many companies are just setting these goals today. So Walmart really was very much way ahead of its time. Now, around 2014, 2015, the big platform companies got into this space and really rocket shipped the efforts even farther and faster than the retailers were doing. But in those days, in 2005, 2006, 2007, there really were almost no mechanisms by which energy customers could send a demand signal and choose the kind of electricity they wanted. Walmart, again, was ahead of its time. We actually had a retail energy arm, so we were already buying retail energy on the spot market. So if you think about big companies buy very few things on a long-term basis. Real estate is just about it. They either lease or buy real estate on a long-term basis. But basically everything else, they buy either on the spot market or as commodities. And Walmart was no exception to that. So at the time, Walmart was buying electricity on the spot market and or just paying monthly utility bills, like most companies still do today. So when the company made the decision to set this 100% renewable energy goal, we had to build whole new frameworks for how to work with utilities, how to work with power producers. That was also the time when the world of power production was becoming more networked. It was no longer just big utilities that you could choose from. You could start to see developers of wind projects, developers of solar projects, who wanted to sell directly to off-takers. So we had to design new ways to do business. And we did that. Google was also one of the very early companies. And if you fast forward to 2013, that was a really pivotal year when a group of large energy customers came together. Google was there, Walmart was there. There were about 12 of us. Coca-Cola was there, Johnson & Johnson was there, Yahoo was there. Who were some of the other platform companies there at that time? Anyway, Salesforce actually was there. In 2013, 3 of those companies had actually successfully procured renewable energy. So 2013, that wasn't that long ago, guys. Some of you, maybe it was, but for many of us in the room, 2013 was, yesterday, and only 3 companies in that room had actually done deals. And that was when we first came up with this idea that we needed a home for energy customers to start sharing best practices. So that's a little bit of the history around companies beginning to think about procuring carbon-free energy. But I think what's really relevant and interesting to this conversation is that energy itself is becoming more platformed. So at one time, we had as we said before, we had a very business to consumer model where there was a utility, that generated power at a big centralized station, and it was like a hub and a spoke, and everybody else got the power from that. If you look at our system today, as Stina was mentioning, we have thousands, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of what we like to call prosumers. Not consumers, not producers, but prosumers. Google, Walmart, Apple, we have energy production on our facilities that we use and we sell back to a utility that can then sell to you. And so there's a new wave of marketplaces, again, thinking of one of the grids you all showed, there's a new wave of marketplaces where we no longer have to buy from one company. And who's going to own that ecosystem? Who's going to own the data? And then who's going to manage that data? Because it's a really different system now than it was even a decade ago. So I'll stop there. I could go on and on, but I'm.
Oh, that is terrific. And if anybody wants to just on the panel poke at Miranda just a little bit, that's fine, or we move on.
Yeah, so so I love this idea that you're talking about, like, kind of new models and all that kind of stuff. What do you think is the biggest challenge with coordination? Because all these companies are huge, right? And they all have their own agendas and they all want to make money. So what do you think we need to do to really make it work with the coordination between players?
Well, this is the big question, and the incumbents, of course, the big utilities, of course, are concerned about the business model where they have owned the production and the distribution, and all we do is take what they give, and they've been extraordinarily successful. For those of you that either have traveled to other countries a lot or are from other countries, you know that the power system in this country is really like none other. We're up 98, 99% of the time. It's a highly productive system, and it's very finely tuned. You often hear people talk about the smart grid, and we need to create the smart grid. We have one of the smartest grids. It's a modern engineering miracle, actually, that the timing of power production to when we're using it is just so perfectly matched and fine-tuned. And so there is a lot of concern as we have prosumers now producing all over the place. And the idea of prosumers and consumers selling directly to each other through a Google platform or through a General Motors platform or through a Meta platform, how does the whole system stay in tune? Because the whole system is connected. And I don't think we've figured that out yet. And that's where regulators are really stepping in to say, how can we do this in a way that's efficient and low carbon without disrupting this finely tuned national machine we've got? So I don't have an answer to the question, actually. I wish I did. I probably wouldn't be sitting here.
Well, I actually love the question because it really gets back to some of the governance principles that we've been hearing as a through line.
Yeah.
Through the day.
I think there's a paper idea for you.
I think there might be. We should write that.
I don't know if I want to write papers.
Okay, so Vanessa, since we're on you, so you co-led McKinsey's innovation practice before leading this Pathways to Commercial Liftoff for DOE, which provides roadmaps, and I think that's really important to accelerate the commercialization of clean energy tech, advanced nuclear, virtual power plants. As you've kind of listened to the day and from some of our discussions, welcome kind of your reflection on how platforms unlock new market opportunities, and it's almost a variation of our existing markets sufficient, and if so, how are you using them, or how could they be used, and if not, where is there a need for new markets, new platforms to support this transition?
So I think in the end, we're all humans who like to be paid and who like to make money, right? I mean, honestly, that is, the fundamental thing. And so as we think about platforms, the question for me always has been, how are people better off if we are able to bring new technologies to market? And so the definition for liftoff to me has always been, at what point in time is the entire ecosystem able to make money with no government support? because it's just working, it's business as usual, and that to me is liftoff because we don't need to infuse, we don't need tax credits, we don't need subsidies because the whole thing's working. And in order to do that, everyone knows, and it was kind of interesting seeing some of the adoption curves that were shown in by a previous speaker, is adoption curves are always also tied to the affordability of technology. And so in order to get technology to scale, we have to make the economics work for the average consumer. Because raise your hand if you want to pay more for something. Yeah, exactly. Nobody ever raises their hand except for a contrarian who just wants to raise their hand. And so the point I'm trying to make is that if we're going to actually get these technologies to the place where they're getting to full-scale deployment and liftoff so everyone here can make money, we have to get the learning curve to the point where our unit economics are in a good spot. Now, the problem with many of the technologies we have right now is that the unit economics are not there because we're at first of a kind, second of a kind. And we're in a capitalistic society, which is great. But what happens is everyone is first in line to be eighth or ninth. You want to be eighth of the kind, ninth of a kind, because at that point you're making money. No one wants to be first or second line. So we're like in the original Squid Games where everyone's on the bridge and like, you go first, no, you go first. And everyone's waiting for someone else to go first. So what's happening? China's going first because they're like, you know what? We're willing to make a loss on trying to get up the learning curve because we know on the other side there's a lot of money. And that's what happened with solar. They were able to invest, get the cost curve down, and then they own the market. We're starting to see the same thing happen in these other technologies. So I think what we have to do and what's been keeping me up at night, now that we had these dozen liftoff reports, what I think we now need to do is understand how do we crowdsource all of the risk and the financing required across the entire ecosystem. So instead of focusing on financing of a first of a kind, we're actually going to be toking. We're going to finance the first 10 of a kind at once. Because if we can peanut butter the risk across a portfolio of 10, we then know we're going to be at a tipping point at the very end, so we can end up getting unit economics we need to get to. But the problem right now is we use ROIs, NPVs, all these things which do not work for first of a kind, second kind, third of a kind. So we need to bring together philanthropy. We need to bring together things like the loan program office. I sat on the credit review board for the loan program office. In statute, it says we have to have a reasonable path of returns before we could say yes to something. I personally think that the federal government should be one of the first lost capitals because the private sector isn't willing to step in. If you take a look at LPO's portfolio, we've actually done better than many other private equity firms, which to me means that we haven't taken enough risk to get the private sector going. So what's the role the federal government plays? What's the role the state government plays? What's the role that off-takers take? I love what the hyperscalers are doing because they're willing to go for long-term off-take agreements when the technology isn't quite there. What's the role that insurance plays, right? Because they are very good at thinking creatively. So we have to come up with brand new financing and risk mitigation structures that are allowing us to peanut butter the risk on the first 10 of a kind. And we have to choose a winning technology so that we can go behind it. There have been 50 first of a kind SMRs. I'm not joking.
Define that for people.
Small modular reactors. And every one of my liftoff reports has a killer chart. That is the killer chart for the SMRs. As you see, we had 50 first of kinds because in America, everything's going to be unique. But we need an IKEA model where we choose one reactor and we mint it out, and then everyone mints it out, and we're all going to be able to win. So I think where we need to go from a platform standpoint is to get rid of the way we think right now for the first 10 of a kind and figure out a way that we crowdsource the risk together. So we're not asking for one entity or a couple of people to take the loss. We all take the loss together. And if we don't do that, then China's going to win.
So I need to do an immediate follow-up because so that all makes a lot of sense. And we talk about sort of the bridge risk-taking to get you over that hump. So in the last congressional bill, it just happened, a week or two ago, July 4th. So the subsidies for solar and wind and other sort of no carbon technologies or low carbon were removed. Should we be worried about that, or should we say, no, they were subsidized for decades and they're across the path, and so let them be free?
Well, here, as I mentioned, if you take a look at liftoff reports, there's actually no policy in it. Because in the end, it's all about how do we get to a point where liftoff is we don't need to rely on those things. So I think if you get to the economies of scale, you don't need it, right? Where I do get more worried are things like the production tax credits and things like that with technologies which aren't yet close to scale.
Yeah.
Because how do you actually get the economics moving fast enough to go do it? And one thing I'm really proud of is we're pretty creative in the Biden administration, where we had $8 billion towards hydrogen hubs. And when we did the liftoff report, like classic technology commercialization, you have the chicken and the egg. No one wants to do a long-term offtake agreement until they know they have a supply chain. No one wants to do a supply chain until they have long-term offtake agreements. So everyone's looking at each other going, who's going to move? So we took $1 billion of the $8 billion. We convinced Congress and the White House to allow us to create a vehicle for a contract for differences, so that whichever hubs made hydrogen first, they couldn't predict what the cost would be, but if someone had signed a long-term offtake agreement and it's a 30 cents per kilo difference, the government would use the $1 billion to help make that contract for differences. Had never been done before to do a demand activation program. So those are the kinds of things that I think we have to creatively think about to help the private sector get the risk to actually balance out. Because if we don't, then no one's going to move here in the US.
I have a question, Vanessa, and I was thinking, Miranda, about the Clean Energy Buyers Association. That was like the first time that you had to, people want something, but they didn't have a way to get it. So you had to create this organization that allowed them to create like a new market that didn't exist before. Mm-hmm. And Vanessa, when you're talking about the first of a kind, I think the elephant in the room in the energy transition is the utilities. I think on the private sector, what you're saying makes sense, how you can create these structures, but what do we do about on the utility side to get incentives lined up?
So that is one that really scratches my head, and specifically in grid enhancing technologies. So one of our liftoff reports looks at things like dynamic line rating, reconductoring, and all that. And we did the economics on it, and basically it's less than 1 year payback if we were to use these technologies. I mean, where do you find less than 1 year payback in anything with utilities? So everyone should be doing it. And why aren't we doing it? Because of the way in which utilities are incented. They're incented by the amount of capital that's deployed. So if I have a technology that's really low capital and is actually able to increase the existing capacity on the current grid by 30%, 1 year payback, they can't do it because they can't get paid for it. So I think this current administration that is willing to do things in a very aggressive way and doesn't care about kind of rules and regulations and the normal way of doing business, they should break through all of this and say, this is insane, right? How do we actually use this? Maybe places like Google and others will pay for the reconductoring, right? Because it costs nothing. And then you guys get, half of the 30%, and the other half goes to the grid. And then we are able to actually buy us time for SMRs and others to get there. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the big thing, is we need disruptive thinkers in government too, to actually make sure that we are incented, because it goes back to humans wanting to make money. I mean, this is what it all boils down to. Yeah. And I think the utilities and regulations are not aligned with what the technology can do now. They were built during a time when they were trying to deploy capital, so we could get electricity built. Now we're in a completely different paradigm, and that platform hasn't evolved. I use the word platform for you. That platform hasn't evolved to the new incentives that have to happen.
Well, I feel like I need to chime in, and Randy, you might say something here too. So since we're talking about reconductoring and Google and CTC Global, which is the largest advanced transmission line company.
And just explain reconductoring.
So
and what
reconductoring,
that does. Yep.
Everybody knows the word retrofitting. If you retrofit a building, you make your building more efficient. Reconductoring is just the way to retrofit a transmission line. So you have an existing electricity transmission line, you're driving down the street, you see them, right? So rather than building a new one, you can just take the old wires off, put new wires on, and you get 30% more electricity across the same wire.
Because it's new materials, so material science is amazing.
Yeah, so it's a material science thing. For those of you who are material scientists, it goes from an aluminum core in this transmission line to a carbon and glass fiber core. And that carbon and glass can just transmit, 30 to 50% more electricity. And in fact, Google said, okay, we're building all these data centers, and Randy, you can chime in at any time, but we're building all these data centers. We need a lot more electricity. We don't want to be the cause of brownouts and blackouts. And we know this technology exists, but the utilities business model doesn't incentivize to do this. They're more incentivized to build a whole new line, which takes 7 to 10 years, a lot more capital infrastructure, but their business model is structured so that that's the way to do it. So Google says, no, we want to start building reconductoring and using advanced conductors on new lines into what we're doing. And it completely flipped the whole thing on its head. So typically a utility would put out an RFP to transmission line companies saying, we're building a new transmission line. Which of you transmission line manufacturers want to bid for this line? Well, this flipped on its head. So now Google and CTC Global put out an RFI to the utilities and said, we want to build new data centers, and our new data centers are going to use this advanced transmission line. Which of you utilities want to bid for the business? Total flip of the business model, quite fascinating, and really good responses to. I mean, this is like literally within the last week. So I just have to build on, and these liftoff reports started to seed some of these ideas out in the marketplace. So I'm sorry, Randy.
I can't improve on those talking points. Thank you so much for.
We're so
for sharing
coordinated
that. Yes.
as a panel.
No, I'm glad it's resonating because I think this connects back to what you were saying, Vanessa, about how do we solve this collective action problem? Well, an important thing to say is that Google, whether it's in energy or in the other realms that I'll be talking about of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, we can't do it ourselves. We're actually a tiny, tiny piece of electricity use, of emissions. We are a small crumb of what needs to be this overall pie of a solution. So how can we create the platform through our actions that helps others come along? And I think the playbook is the same on the energy side and on the carbon credits and removals side. It's defining what good looks like. It's creating sort of a common standard around that. And then it's bringing others along to be inspired by some of the things that maybe we're risk tolerant enough to do first. We can inspire others to follow in our wake on. I don't know if it's worth elaborating on how we're bringing that approach on.
Well, maybe I'll just ask the question, and then you can kind of merge these that we talked about, because you're leading the efforts in carbon credits and removals, and you eloquently talked about sort of the removal part as being so critical. So I think it's actually worth dwelling on the definitions a little bit, just for people in the room that are not sort of immersed and steeped in this. And then critically, thinking about the data layer, how do you verify that parties to a transaction are fulfilling commitments? Because arguably, you can't have contracting, you can't build markets without some verifiability. And then, what does that look like? And then what sort of markets would help encourage participation, increase transparency? And then ultimately, it's the collective action and scaling.
Yeah.
So I think it dovetails to where you were going.
Okay, so big topic. Forgive me for taking a big step back here, but to give you a sense of where these efforts relate to each other, Google signed its first clean energy PPA 15 years ago. And we signed our first carbon removal offtake deal 2 years ago. So this is basically an attempt to follow the same kind of playbook that we have been talking about, but it's newer. And as you were hinting, Jeff, it has different challenges because of the units involved. So if you think about clean energy, okay, there are a lot of ways to generate energy, but ultimately it all boils down to electrons. It's the same way of measuring what you get out of it, and there are a lot of common threads between all of these technologies. They all have to ultimately plug into some kind of a grid infrastructure. It's very different for carbon credits and removals, because again, that is just solving the problem that is left over after you finish decarbonization. Decarbonizing the electric system, the energy system is great, and unfortunately, even after we do that, we'll still have two problems relevant to climate change. We'll have the near-term problem of peak warming, things are getting hotter already, and unfortunately, in some cases, decarbonization has a longer-acting approach than you might think, because aerosols are sometimes going down as the energy is getting cleaner, which actually has a worse impact on temperatures than you'd imagine. And there's the long-term problem. Even after we decarbonize, we'll still have way too much CO2 in the atmosphere. We are up past 420 parts per million, where pre-industrial average was 280 parts per million. So carbon credits and removals, to get back to your question, are assets denominated in tons CO2 equivalent that simply express how much impact are we having on the atmosphere. And so when you think about clean energy, it's all measured in electrons. It's a little more easy to get your head around. Well, carbon credits and removals, there are a lot of ways to skin the cat of how do you help the atmosphere. and they all can look quite different. The nature of the impact of planting a tree somewhere to remove CO2 from the atmosphere via photosynthesis and store it for perhaps on the order of decades before the tree burns down and decomposes, is very different from the impact that you get from building a machine that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere and stores it in a geologic well, which in turn is different from the impact you get from destroying a non-CO2 greenhouse gas, like methane, that was leaking out of a landfill, which is a short-lived gas, but a huge warmer in that near term. Now, Google does all of those things. How are you supposed to make sense of all of those things together? Well, there is this common unit of ton CO2 equivalent, but to get to that common unit, you need a lot of sort of more bespoke to the individual technological intervention measurement techniques, which are known as methodologies, which are currently policed by registries that sort of have these sets of, okay, here's what impact looks like for this project, here's the verification that shows that this project went through these steps and did everything, and here's the monitoring and verification past the point of project intervention to make sure that the impact stays where it is. Now, if that sounds crazy and confusing, yeah, it is. It's a tangled mess. And like I tell anybody who listens, there's a reason that we don't do this. We don't do this intangible outcome measurement in other parts of the economy. Like, you don't roll up at your doctor's office and pay them for quality adjusted life years that they have added to you, right? Because it would be really hard to calculate that. And you're just like, how are you going to put these different techniques in? But I think it's worth getting that right. For this field, because if you get it right, then you're suddenly doing the thing that we ultimately will need to do to fix climate change, and that is pay people to the extent they are fixing the atmosphere. Again, we will need that on top of decarbonization to limit the peak warming near term by doing things like destroying superpollutants, the ultimate handbrake on climate change, and shoring up the terrestrial biomass sinks like forests that we absolutely need to keep our climate in balance in the near term. And in the long term, we'll need to invest in a bunch of technologies to go the last mile of actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it for a long period of time. So last thing I'll say, to the point of how are we building on the foundation? Because this isn't our first rodeo. We've done something like this for energy. Yes, it didn't have these challenges of all the different ways of measuring this stuff, which makes it a little bit tricky. But we are trying to follow the same sort of playbook of going first and identifying what good looks like. But not just going first ourselves, bringing other people along and solving this collective action problem by doing something collectively. So just a couple of the highlights of what Google's done so far in this field. 3 years ago, we co-founded Frontier, which is this advanced market commitment. A bunch of places, it's Google, Meta, McKinsey, Stripe, all came together and said, you know what, we're going to collectively pledge around $1 billion of payments to technologies that don't exist yet that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it permanently. We did the same thing last year for called Symbiosis Coalition, same kind of AMC concept, same magnitude for nature-based carbon removal. And now we're contemplating similar ideas for superpollutant destruction. So how do we get more people in the room to kickstart this stuff, show what good looks like, create as common a standard as possible, and then build on top of that platform that we're actively constructing?
I'd invite any probes before I move on, if you have any.
Randy, can you talk about why Google and everybody got together to want to do this?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's worth highlighting. This is entirely voluntary. There's not anyone twisting our arms to get involved in this stuff. And so a very fair question is why bother? Let's just wait around. And I mean, the honest answer is, let's think about what problems there are to solve in the world, and which of those problems is going to increase in relevance over time versus decrease in relevance over time. Well, I'd say what you just said, Jeff, about Boston feeling kind of hot, I'd bet on that as an increasing in relevance over time problem. And that is the sort of problem that Google likes to solve. If we just thought about what the pressures are today, then there probably wouldn't be people getting around in robots in San Francisco right now. We think about long-term problems that are likely to remain really important, however thorny the solutions may be to them. And given that that's going to be an enduring problem that people care about, would you rather figure out how to do it right and get really good at it starting now, or would you rather wait till it smacks you in the face? I think we'd rather do the former.
I think that's a really important question, though, and I think back to the early days at Walmart, and our chief marketing officer was asked a question like this: Why did Walmart set this 100% renewable energy goal? Particularly, people on the East Coast and West Coast already hate Walmart and won't shop there, no matter what they do. So it wasn't like it boosted our reputation with those folks. And for many parts of the country, it could actually erode our customer base, right? So we had just as many people at our shareholder meeting standing up saying, Lee Scott's a tree-hugging leftist. Why is he focusing on this? He should just be focusing on shareholder value, right? And our chief marketing officer got up on stage, and first of all, he talked about his children. And then he said, at the time, we were Fortune #1. This was, I'm looking back at your slides. Now, that was market cap, but Fortune 500 looks at revenue, and we were Fortune #1. And he said, look, the world expects something different of you when you are Fortune #1. And the same is true, I would say, for sort of Fortune 10, Fortune 20. And those are companies that want to be around long term and are looking at these as enduring problems that are going to only increase. And if you are a retailer and you need to source tomatoes and you're not paying attention to what the local weather patterns look like and how they're changing and who's going to get super floods and who's going to be in super drought, and you're not paying attention to where you're going to buy tomatoes next year and 10 years from now, you're not staying on top of things. And there's all kinds of other reasons around workforce and that kind of thing. But these are all voluntary. These are voluntary platforms, and these are companies made up of individual people. And that's what gives me a lot of excitement. I have an intern right now who just graduated undergrad, sort of very skeptical about big companies and nobody grows up in business school. You can go take entrepreneur classes. Jeff, we've talked about this. You can go take entrepreneur classes. You're celebrated if you're an entrepreneur. Nobody gets celebrated for going to work for the U.S. government. Nobody gets celebrated for going to work for Walmart. These entrepreneur, but having this intern meet all these folks from Netflix, from Google, from Johnson & Johnson, from Coca-Cola, and see, okay, these are real people with real kids that are worried about the real same problems that we've got and are trying to leverage their organizations. But the why really comes back to solving the big problems.
Yeah.
Nope, nothing against entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are awesome too.
And we have one. But I just have to sort of put in a plug. I mean, many of the hardest working people I've met on the planet have been political appointees for our agencies because they're able to attract really talented people who really do the public service. So
We didn't
just,
sleep.
Yeah, I mean, just have to kind of weigh on, and I know you've also done that with the Air Force, Miranda. So Stina, now moving into entrepreneurship, you lead Derapi. So that is a software as a service firm, and you mentioned how you're able to instrument a wide variety of distributed energy resources, and that helps you connect and control these devices. So again, for the non-kind of energy insiders, I'd like you to describe the types of the data streams, just so people have some understanding of sort of what the bits look like. And then talk a little bit about the types of services that you can create with that data and to kind of connect the dots. Randy was talking about the carbon credits and the need for this collective action and then the verifiability. How do you see this through line of kind of these markets and DER markets and how this and how Derapi and firms like yours can support the development of markets and platforms?
Yeah, sure. So I think it is interesting to think about whether the electricity grid is a platform, Jeff. On the quizzes over there, it was kind of hard to map everything together. I think one of the things that lacks is the interaction, right? So that's why Miranda had to start this SIBA that allowed, people want to interact. People want to have choices about what kind of electricity they're getting or what the impacts of that are, or if they're carbon neutral or not. And I think it's been hard for businesses and consumers to do that. So what we are, and in my career, I have been working with these distributed energy resources for about 20 years. I was at Enernoc back in the mid-2000s, where we also were working with commercial and industrial customers and helping them participate in the grid. They would reduce energy usage when the grid was stressed out to help avoid blackouts. And so those were, I think, some of the early ways that folks got involved. But it was limited in what they could do. And certainly there were no internet-connected devices, so it was all very manual. We were like calling people on the phone and asking them to stop using electricity. And then, 10 years ago, I was at a company called Sunverge Energy, and there we were using batteries at residential customer homes and grouping them together to get them to discharge to the grid during key times to help utilities avoid, again, peak congestion issues and blackouts, hopefully. And then there were not that many devices 10 years ago. So Tesla Powerwall was coming out, but there, maybe there was one or two other types of batteries. EVs, there weren't as many EVs. Smart, Nest thermostat was kind of had emerged at that point. And so even then, we were building this software platform where we wanted to interact with these devices, but we actually had to also sell hardware so that we could have something to interact with because there weren't that many out there. And then ultimately, I guess then my next step was at Proterra, where I was doing commercial electric vehicles. And the interesting part about that was it was kind of the first time that many of these commercial organizations who were adopting these like transit fleets, transit bus fleets that were electric or school bus fleets that were electric, first time they started thinking about energy usage. And I think once you become big enough, once you start using enough energy, like Walmart has for years, or Google, you start wanting to do more or be more thoughtful about how you're getting that energy. And again, it's very limited in what you can do. So I think what we're seeing is that we're moving towards a grid that needs to become two-way, both from a technological perspective, but also maybe from a business perspective. You were asking about markets, Jeff, earlier, right? To Vanessa, and I think there need to be maybe some more opportunities for people to ask for what they want and try to get it. So more tactically for what Derapi's doing, we are an API, so computer-to-computer interactions here between the devices themselves, these batteries, these solar inverters, these EV chargers, and we are talking to those devices on behalf of our customers who are platform companies that are trying to do smart things for the grid. So Enernoc was, back 20 years ago, was an early example of this, but it's these virtual power plant companies like, for example, Uplight, there's Energy Hub, there's Virtual Peaker, there's all these companies that, on behalf of utilities, will go out and acquire a bunch of customers who have these devices, and then the utilities ask them to do something for the grid at key times. So right now we've got a couple hundred batteries at homes in Connecticut, and for the last 15 days, we've been discharging those batteries every day in the evening because it's been super hot and to support the grid because of all the HVAC load that's been going on. So that's an example there. And so our customer is a platform company called Uplight, and they have thousands of devices connected, and we represent the batteries that connect to their platform. They're also sending signals to thermostats and to other EV chargers and things like that. But my vision is that all of these devices that are out there should serve the customer where they're located. But also they need to participate in the grid so that we can have this two-way grid, so that we can move toward a grid that has a lot of flexibility and is more resilient and more sustainable in the future.
So I'm going to flip the question back to you that you asked me. So how do we get utilities to change their business model so that they can actually be supporting customers if they want to do this?
Yeah, so I have been trying to sell to utilities for like 20 years, and finally at Derapi, I'm like, you know what, forget it. I'm going to sell to these other companies and let them try to sell to the utilities, because it is so hard and demoralizing, really, Vanessa. But I think that what we see right now is that with all the AI hyperscalers and the data centers coming on board, electricity is going to be so expensive that consumers are going to be adopting even more of these devices. People are going to start, soft defecting from the grid to save money. And utilities aren't going to be able to upgrade the grid fast enough to be able to keep it reliable and cost effective for everybody. So they're going to have to use these resources that are already there. These resources are already out in the distribution grid, and so they can serve the load right where they're at. It's kind of like how Sam Altman wants to put these fusion or nuclear power plants right next to data centers. We're doing that on a tiny little scale where there's little batteries and things everywhere by people's homes. And I'll say the liftoff reports are fantastic, and we have used them extensively in our business. And thankfully, I've downloaded copies because I'm not sure they're all available anymore. Vanessa.
Well, if everyone needs them, I also have downloaded copies.
Okay. So really appreciate that. I think it really gave folks handbooks for how to keep moving forward, like you've said. And so the VPP one has been critical.
And the long duration energy storage one, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just amplify something you said because I think it's really important. You talked about Sam Altman, and I think that's the Helion and sort of the investments in fusion and the idea that you have these big sources co-located with big loads, and that solves, a potential problem. But one of the things that we learned in the last round of kind of the platform explosion, if you will, around things like Airbnb and Uber was the degree to which there's a lot of spare capacity in the economy. And so one of the problems that you solve is one of kind of missing markets, and they were missing because there were large transaction costs. You literally just said, we used to have to pick up the phone and call. If that's not a transaction cost, I don't know what is, in order to get an asset to take an action. And now with sort of persistent connectivity, and then hopefully increasingly economic signals as opposed to some utility program, you can get those distributed resources to start to look like a big machine. And that's kind of the promise, and we've been looking at that for a long time and waiting, and it's sounding like we're getting a little bit closer, which is pretty exciting. But I just wanted to say, it's not always these kind of Promethean giant technology investment solutions. There's a lot of room just to take advantage of the slack in systems that we could also coordinate with markets. So we have time for a few questions. I can go all day. I'm a trained professor, and just wind me up. And with this crowd, I'm not even sure I have to ask questions. They'll just ask one another. But if it looks like we have a couple of takers. So again, if you could introduce yourself and your affiliation, fire away.
I'm Aaron Holm from Helix. The question is for Vanessa. You said something that piqued my interest, this notion of crowdsourcing risk to achieve liftoff. How do you incentivize that?
So I personally believe, right, that the energy demand is going to be so great that if we can get things like SMR, geothermal, and all of that, it's necessary as breathing air. And so I think if we don't get there, then the fundamental business isn't going to work for everybody. So the incentive is you look at the exponential explosion, right, required of energy, we have to do something. And I think the hyperscalers are seeing that, which is why they're doing some of these bold things. But in the end, I think the incentive is if you don't do it and you don't join this, then you're not going to have the blueprints that are at scale and at cost to go after it. So we're hoping FOMO.
So you threaten their existence.
Yeah, no, FOMO, but it's just like, it's not even that. It's like if you don't do this, then you're going to be disrupted by the people who are willing to step in right now and take the losses because they know on the other side they need this.
Yeah.
And you can choose not to, but you're going to have FOMO later.
And you find that they're willing to take some loss of profit, loss of...
Not yet, and that's what we're working on right now.
Yeah.
So I have been talking to a lot of different stakeholders around wanting to model this out and then running the different scenarios. Because the problem is there's different types of risk that, for example, you take a look at nuclear, oftentimes just like construction projects, it takes too much time. So if a project is late, who is going to end up taking that risk, right?
Yeah.
If you have like costs. So we have to model these things out and then say, if you're in the situation, what are people willing to do or not do? And then can we create like insurance products on the backside, which are underwritten by government to cover the risks that people aren't willing to?
We should talk, because the same dynamics exist with housing costs.
Yep.
So I'll just add to this a little bit. Randy spoke a little bit, but pretty quickly about these advanced market commitments, AMCs, that we're starting to see some of the really big companies come together, pretty small coalitions typically, because if the coalition becomes too big, it starts to get really complicated with different credit worthiness of off-takers, general counsels not wanting to standardize contracts. So it is complicated when you do a coalition. But these advanced market commitment coalitions that Google and Microsoft and Nucor and McKinsey and some others have done at pretty small scale to say, we will buy firm, carbon-free, available 24/7 power of any type. It might be nuclear, it might be geothermal, it might be, but it needs to be projects 1 through 10. And we're going to put an advanced market commitment out there to do that. Now then the question becomes, Why are they doing that? That was Stina's question before. Are they going to pay more than whatever their typical electricity price is, or what a wind power purchase agreement or a solar power purchase agreement, which is like pennies now? Why do those things? And I think part of what incentivizes companies to do these advanced market commitments, and Randy, jump in to add your thoughts here, but part of it is we are having an electricity shortage for the first time in 15 years in this country. For the last 15 years, our power demand has been basically flat despite our economy growing for a couple of reasons. One, we've improved energy efficiency a lot. Two, we've outsourced our most electric intensive industries, manufacturing and stuff. We've moved that overseas and we've become more of a service industry. So as we're bringing back manufacturing, mining, more and more data centers, electrification of vehicles, electrification of buildings, we're now starting to see a rise in electricity demand again for the first time in 15 years. So more and more companies that are trying to build new facilities of whatever type, they need that power, and so they're doing more creative things.
Do those AMCs qualify for financing?
I'm actually going to move on to the next
Okay.
the next questioner.
Hi, I'm Sean Stockman. I'm with OnePack and the Return Center. Steve Vanden was on the panel earlier. And kind of going back to a recurring theme in each of these sessions is starting with governance and the control of a platform, and kind of thinking about that in the context of sort of peanut butter spreading the risk of investment. I love that concept of sort of crowdsourcing innovation. And by the way, thank you for public service, Vanessa. Liftoff reports are fantastic. How do you see the role of the top 10, whether it's Fortune 10 or top 10 platforms? How do you see their role in sort of a crowdsourcing approach to policy development and regulation development to get to the governance nexus between industry and government, where there's obviously a lot of incentive to do the right thing, and everyone wants to make money and save reduce the carbon footprint and all that stuff.
Great question.
But there's a gap between what the top 10 want to do, and they're going to have to probably do it themselves, and then you've got an administration that may have a completely wildly different approach. What's the role of those top 10 with developing the policy that's going to propel us forward in that direction?
Well, first of all, I think we are closer than one thinks. And I think both sides actually spread stories that make us seem not as aligned. Because what I would say is that this current administration wants affordable energy, right? And they are an all-of-energy approach. So if there's a way you can, and they're all in on nuclear, they're all in on geothermal, they're all in on SAF in some areas, right? And so I think that if you start looking at that as the lens, which is we want more energy that's affordable, and that is what you guys want as well, then as top 10s, then I think we ask ourselves, what is preventing it? And that is where these issues with how utilities are incented, that is a perfect place where policy has to step in. Places where you think about permitting. We know when we did geothermal, we had a thing where we said, look, if you are drilling for oil and gas, you do not need a permit for geothermal. It's the same thing. And so there's things like that where I think common sense will actually help to accelerate stuff. And I think it's really important to figure out where we have the same goals. Start there, and then I think we can get us to mesh.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
And I guess I'd add just it's really clear to everyone that no one can do this alone. Like everyone needs to come together. But it's also really clear to your point, Miranda, about advanced market commitments that we can do this together. Before they were used in this context, the advanced market commitments were pioneered in global health for vaccine development. To your point about people want to make money, Vanessa, drug developers will put in the research to create a vaccine if there's a big paycheck that is waiting for them at the end of that. And if you're in the top 10, if you're in governments, I think that you are in some way within the group of people who has to move first in getting together and dangling that carrot in front of the right people to create the right incentives.
So last question.
Hi there, my name is Alexander Olson with Buckstop. We're building a circular economy platform for energy and industrial assets. And I have a two-part question. Firstly,
keep it really short.
they're very closely related. Firstly, what are the key bottlenecks with upgrading the energy infrastructure that you see today? And then the second part of the question is, with every upgrade, there's waste. What are the current options for utility providers and power providers in dealing with their waste, either through resale and recycling?
Well, I personally am going to talk about GETS again. I mean, that's where I would go first. And then I think once we do that, we are able to fulfill over the next 3 to 5 years some of the increases that we're seeing. And then in parallel, hopefully SMRs and some of these other things come about. And I personally think if it's also co-located with where the demand is, then it's even more efficient and from an infrastructure standpoint. I don't know if you guys have thoughts.
I agree. The biggest bottleneck is in the transmission system, and so the grid enhancing technologies, advanced transmission through reconductoring and retrofitting and transmission systems, that's how we get there the fastest. But we also need to do the longer term things, like particularly permitting is becoming more and more challenging. So we really need to accelerate how the rules and governance systems around how we make permitting decisions and try to accelerate that work. I actually personally don't believe that new generation is the biggest bottleneck. There's lots of generation ready and waiting to be built.
I wish I had a clown car with me so that all my fellow Googlers who are working on every little part of this problem could jump out. Like, think a lot about circular economy and avoiding waste as part of this overall thing. And I guess it just points to there are so many problems to be solved, and as part of this, it's not one silver bullet that takes care of this, climate situation that we're in. We have to think about all of the aspects. So thanks for bringing them up.
Stina, last word.
I think that we need everything, all of the above, right? There's not going to be a silver bullet, so we need to take advantage of the distribution grid assets, build new transmission, get all these new things going. So everybody's contributions are needed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And look, we
managed.
nailed the landing.
That was a
6
perfect
seconds
last
left.
question. That was a perfect last
Lovely.
question.
Join me in thanking the panel.